I want to first thank everyone at the Center for Jewish Studies, including Natasha, Camila, Galina Weissman, for making this physically possible to have this lecture series occur and to continue online. And I also want to thank Anna Sternschus and Doris Bergen and other colleagues in the department for making this such an incredible postdoctoral fellowship experience. I've really benefited so much from my time here. So I'm just going to share my screen before I begin the presentation here. Okay, hopefully you're able to see that. And lastly, I'd also like to thank everyone tuning in. It's really exciting to see so many participants and sort of not being able to see your faces. Know that I'm really thrilled that you're tuning in and that you're here. So broadly speaking, my research focuses on marginalized experiences of Jewish memory and subjectivity. Usually when I explain my work to a group of people, I imagine that it might speak most to those who can relate to experiences of living on the margins in one way or another. At this moment in time, however, with a public health crisis that urges us to practice social distancing from each other, I think we can all on some level relate to that experience of marginality to varying extents, facing new levels of disruption, displacement, and uncertainty, sometimes needing to harness creativity and social resources from afar in order to survive this episode in our history. In my view, some of the most fascinating and visionary aspects of the Jewish experience have existed on the margins, where subjects struggle creatively to survive, to make meaning, and sometimes even to improve or repair those systems that might endanger them. In that vein, my work takes interest in Jewish social outliers, including immigrants, refugees, racial minorities, subjects marked by trauma, LGBTQ people, and children. In the present talk, I offer a portion, as Professor Sternschus mentioned, of the argument that I make in my forthcoming book, Wild Visionary, Maurice Sendak in Queer Jewish Contexts. This project studies the life and work of the late Jewish American and queer artist Maurice Sendak, who lived between 1928 and 2012, best known for picture books like Where the Wild Things Are, published in 1963. Sendak grew up as the youngest child of Sadie and Philip, Yiddish-speaking Jewish immigrants from small towns near Warsaw, Poland, who each immigrated alone to Brooklyn shortly before World War I. The Sendaks made their home in Bensonhurst and Gravesend, neighborhoods where Maurice spent his youth in the 1930s and 40s. My book mobilizes a historically contextualized account of Sendak's life and work to advance and generate new dimensions of cultural theory. It is the first scholarly monograph to focus on sexuality, Jewishness, and their intersections in Sendak's life and work, more fully situating this cultural giant within the fields of Jewish American immigration, Holocaust memory, LGBTQ history, and the history of modern childhood. Ultimately, the project argues that Sendak's particular experience of Jewishness, queerness, and their intersections directly impacted his creative contributions to literary and affective shifts in American children's literature in the mid-20th century, as well as offered new mirrors of resilience, not only for children, but also for other marginal individuals accustomed to misrecognition, creative shapeshifting, and the employment of fantasy for survival, qualities I note that are ascribed both to children and outsiders alike. Wild Visionary advances the field of Jewish studies by attending to social elements neglected in traditional historiography, not only queer Jews, but Jewish children and Yiddish-speaking Jews who remained on the margins of the post-war middle class, resisted generic acculturation, and who openly discussed and mourned the events of the Holocaust as they occurred. The present talk will demonstrate 2 points from the wider argument. First, I show how Sendak's creative sensibilities convey his historically specific position as an American child of Yiddish-speaking immigrants impacted by Holocaust losses. To argue this point, I offer close readings of Sendak's writing and a selection of his creative work, as well as broader cultural examples, including the Yiddish children's periodical, the Kinder Zhurnal. I analyze these using theory from trauma and memory studies that describe impulses towards self-evacuation and investment in the past. Second, I show how Sendak channeled marginalized Jewish sensibilities and emotional rhythms of a Holocaust-marked adolescence into creative battlegrounds for challenging wider American conceptions of childhood. I'll begin first with my theoretical framework. Literary scholar Kathy Carruth has described trauma as an unclaimed experience, as she calls it, an internalization that is too painful or chaotic for consciousness to fully claim or to sufficiently process as a lived experience, yet on the other hand, also too eventful and penetrating to discard altogether. In the case of Sendak, whose work invested intensely in the memory of relatives murdered in the Holocaust, the news of their deaths during his adolescence represented a complicated and overwhelming matrix of violent meanings. The deaths of these relatives signified a lost connection to spaces of ethnic and cultural belonging, the resulting incapacitation of his own caretakers, on whom he depended for survival, and an internalized belief that people like him were not safe in the world. His father, Philip, had even assured him that the Holocaust could happen in America and told him to keep a suitcase packed in the closet just in case. As a queer outsider who struggled to make friends and fixated on the various forms of endangerment he internalized, he would later claim, and I quote him, "I skipped my adolescence, total amnesia." The perceived displacement of Sendak's adolescence situates him within the realm of Kathy Carruth's unclaimed experience. Similarly, within memory studies, Marianne Hirsch's theory of post-memory refers to what it means to grow up intertwined with a parent's overwhelmingly meaningful, but also inaccessible experience of endangerment and loss. The parent's unresolved and all-pervasive psychology, as it manifests in behavior and relational style, leads post-memorial children to feel haunted or threatened by a past that they did not themselves experience, as well as compelled to piece that past together or somehow relate to it creatively. While Hirsch illuminates how a parent's history might displace a child's own narrative, queer theory understands the capacity of wider, dominant cultural ideas and structures to occupy and suppress a child's experience. The queer child, for example, is displaced by the overarching norms and expectations of a prevailing social order that condemns the child's emergent identity or desires as impossible or unwelcome. Catherine Bond Stockton paints queer childhood as a time of ghostly self-evacuation, under the prohibition of claiming one's own stigmatized internal reality, at least until adulthood. Sendak fought to embody and assert his own feelings and sense of self against an overwhelming set of adult-imposed obstacles. As he wrote, he felt like the changeling ice baby he would depict in Outside Over There in 1981, which you see on screen, switched and replaced by some false version of himself to which his mother had no awareness. The artist would base Outside Over There on what he called the hell of growing up without knowing who to talk to, who to trust, and how to function. Sendak described his own childhood exclusion from the wider culture and from dominant channels of meaning-making, and his consequent difficulty coming into his own feelings and actualizing as a coherent subject. To understand how such individuals cope and survive, Stockton also offers us a theory called growing sideways, a proposition that queer or displaced subjects who cannot authentically grow upward or forward instead grow sideways or outward, projecting themselves into uncharted, sometimes hidden spaces of culture that society perceives as incoherent, wild, or avant-garde. A central thread in my book analyzes the queerness of Sendak's displacement as he depicted it, emphasizing the dynamic intersection between Jewish and other forms of difference in America. Sendak's work responds to a theoretical figure that children's literature scholar Nicholas Salmond calls the generic child. This figure emerged in America's cultural imagination between 1900 and 1960. As a cultural symbol, the generic child represented the ideals that shaped how Americans strove to raise their children, and the personification of innocence against which critics of commercial culture complained. This child symbol was conceived as an obedient, physically restrained, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant child with uncomplicated emotions, epitomized by the Dick and Jane readers published between 1930 and 1965. Populations seeking entry into the middle class were often eager to obey the prescriptions of the generic child, which operated as a cultural site of debate about who warranted inclusion in the nation's future and under which conditions. Children's literature about ethnic minorities in the immediate post-war years helped integrate the image of so-called white ethnic families, including most Jewish, Irish, and Italian Americans, as normative, lighthearted, decorous, and thoroughly American. Jewish children's periodicals, for example, reflect American Jews' emotional shift towards suburban middle-class belonging and optimism at mid-century. The Kinder Zhurnal revamped its cover arts by the late 1940s with a more childish aesthetic. In April 1946, the periodical shifted from previous cover arts featuring ornamental patterns and majestic animals to introduce wide-eyed, cartoonish children, accompanied by dolls, baseball bats, and playful cartoon animals. In the 1946 Jewish Book Annual, a librarian at the Boston Public Library noted that the 20th century had turned out to be what she called the children's century, because with the help of public education and higher living standards, it seemed the entire nation concerned itself with creating an improved, ideal future for American children. In the same breath, she pointed to the role of children's books as key effective tools in such endeavors, because they helped normalize children's emotions and behaviors, guiding them on how to integrate into the wider society. Sidney Taylor's book, All of a Kind Family, in 1951, offered optimism about such forms of integration, even becoming the first children's book series about Jews to attract a large Gentile readership. During this cultural moment, American Jews, broadly speaking, secured their middle-class belonging, at least in part, through the generic child. Children's literature, previously marginal in American publishing, exploded in the post-war decades as a profitable beacon of middle-class American idealism. The post-war baby boom and its accompanied rise in funding for public schools and libraries created a thriving market that prompted publishers to expand their lists. Children's editors, librarians, and critics rose to influence, empowered by their authority to designate the prestigious Newbery and Caldecott medals. However, despite these advances, children's literature in the 1950s was still relatively obscure and marginalized within the broader fields of publishing and visual art, a fact that perhaps counterintuitively attracted socially insecure artists like Sendak himself. These artists could create their most genuine, heartfelt work off the map, so to speak, relatively unseen by adult authorities. In a later interview, Sendak would reflect on his career in the following words, and I quote him, "I didn't have much confidence in myself, never, and so I hid inside this modest form called the children's book and expressed myself entirely. I'm like a guerrilla warfare in my best books." Eschewing the generic child, Sendak's depictions drew directly from the emotional underbelly of Jewish Brooklyn. His work championed a more complex vision of children's capacities and claimed ground for marginal American subjects more broadly. Much unlike Dick and Jane or Sidney Taylor's characters, whose emotional styles and behaviors were virtually indistinguishable from the ideals of the Gentile middle class, Sendak's ethnically distinct children did not always behave innocently or remain within the confines of a protected domestic sphere in the suburbs. Like immigrants or other minority subjects, they often grappled with deep-seated, often invisible dilemmas and emotional crises. They navigated cultural gaps between home and the public sphere, as well as between personal orientations and the social pressures of post-war America. Throughout his career, Sendak would invite both controversy and admiration for his radical departure from the generic child ideal, challenging American children's book conventions of depicting normative children in an emotionally subdued, rose-colored world. His rebellious, ethnic-looking children were among the first in children's literature to exhibit rage and emotional excess, as well as to demand love. His Harper editor Ursula Nordstrom called Where the Wild Things Are the first picture book to recognize the fact that children have powerful emotions, anger and love and hate, and only after all that passion, the wanting to be where someone loved them best of all. In the remainder of my talk, I demonstrate the emotional circumstances of Sendak's youth in a Yiddish-speaking home marked by the Holocaust, and I analyze the impact on his work and to the challenges his work posed to the generic child. Sendak claims that he had internalized the fragility of his existence well before World War II, as a sickly Brooklyn infant before penicillin, whose immigrant parents fretted openly about the possibility of him dying, and then raised him during the Great Depression. Accordingly, his work focused on a single question that obsessed him: how do children survive? In his own words, his art would repeatedly ask, how do you prevent dying? How do you prevent being eaten or mauled by a monster? His caretakers conveyed historically based anxieties to him. Jews are targeted with violence. Children lose their parents and die unprotected sometimes. Families like Sendak's held tight to their children and imbued them with values of resilience and survivalism. They stressed the importance of political consciousness and in-group loyalty, even as they pushed their children to achieve American successes. Sendak's home was an atmosphere of emotionally fraught insecurity and close-knit family bonds. His mother, Sadie, and maternal grandmother, Minnie, instilled a fearful wariness of non-Jews within the dominant population, recounting pogroms in their old village of Zakrochem in Poland, during which Cossacks ransacked Minnie's grocery store. Minnie would push Sadie and her siblings into the cellar to hide. By age 4, Sendak would have recurring nightmares of this sort. Despite his sensitivity to such frightening recollections, however, he considered one of the highlights of his childhood to be the violent, fantastical stories told to him by his father, Philip, at bedtime. Likely drawing from the midrashic tales and folklore of his own cheder community as a child in Zembrowa in Poland, Philip embellished otherwise truthful renderings of his youth with elements of fantasy, biblical stories, and ghost tales. These cliffhanger meiselech, or short tales in Yiddish, which often extended over multiple nights, included the terror of Cossacks and Polish peasants wielding clubs studded with nails. They also featured children who got lost, fell asleep in the snow, or struggled to find their parents after a period of separation. In one story, for example, a child loses his way in the winter, sobs under a tree, and passes away from the cold. Abraham and Sarah emerge from the Bible then to usher him to heaven. In another story, a boy named David finds his lost parents among a hunter's horde of kidnapped slaves, and despite his eagerness to reunite with them, pretends not to recognize them so that the hunter will not suspect him of trying to free them. Philip's stories would blend in his son's imagination with fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm. These also used metaphor, repetition, and hyperbole to offer wild, poignant truths and warnings about the real world, even to children. Sendak would later illustrate some of these tales in a collection called In Grandpa's House, published in 1985, based on the original Yiddish stories as told by Philip. And you see on screen a couple of illustrations from that work. On the left, you'll note, for those of you who read Yiddish, the name Zembrowa, the name of Philip's town, is written, as well as an advertisement, Chalas auf Shabbos in Yiddish, challah for sale for Shabbat. The Sendaks were not alone in narrating dark or upsetting situations to their children. Reflecting generations of oral storytelling in Jewish Poland, bedtime stories in many Yiddish-speaking immigrant families, like Sendak's, reflected the need to nourish the child's capacity to locate and heed dangerous situations. This is also reflected in Yiddish children's literature published in interwar Europe and America, which also handled difficult themes of war, violence, mortality, racism, and lynching. Tapping into American racial issues, for example, a Yiddish children's story published in the May 1933 issue of the Kinder Zhurnal depicts and condemns the public lynching of an African-American man in Georgia. Yiddish children's literature of the 1930s, like Philip's bedtime stories, reflected the harsh realities that Jews and others faced at home and abroad, as well as the general atmosphere one might experience under oppressive regimes. If Sadie and Philip burdened their children or exposed them to harsh realities, Sendak understood their emotional transparency as more respectful of their children's human capacities than a stance of concealment or condescension would have been. What might have struck outsiders as an immigrant parent's lack of social refinement by public standards in narrating such dark content to one's children was thus for Sendak a means of trust building and emotional connection against the restraint and mannered calculation of mainstream parenting ideals. As Sendak once mused, and I quote him, "My parents were immigrants, and they didn't know that they should clean their stories up for us. So we heard horrible, horrible stories. And we loved them. We absolutely loved them." Sendak, repeating the details of these stories, would be repeatedly sent home by teachers to have his mouth washed out with soap. While parent-child relations in families like Sendak's might have challenged social laws of propriety, they also elicited strong emotional bonds and inspired wild fantasies in the service of humor and truth-seeking within an othered family unit. Beyond his immediate family, the artist's more distant greenhorn relatives, as he called them, were some of the most frightening and inspiring. He would famously recall a typical Sunday afternoon in the late 1930s in which his Polish refugee relatives would come over and devour much of the Sendak's food. As a child whose cheeks they pinched, Sendak almost feared that they'd eat him as well. These relatives, as he repeatedly claimed, would later serve as the primary inspiration for the Wild Things who entreat Max with their haunting plea, "Oh, please don't go. We'll eat you up. We love you so." Like the Wild Things, Sendak recalled his relatives as, and I quote, "a huge bunch who would roughly snatch you up at any moment. They'd jabber loudly in a foreign tongue, kiss, pinch, maul, and hug you breathless, all in the name of love. Their dread faces loomed, flushed, jagged teeth flaring, eyes inflamed, and great nose hairs cascading, all oddly smelly and breathy, all dangerous, all growling, all relatives." If Sendak saw his relatives as somewhat dangerous or wild as a child, he also venerated them. The artist consistently applauded his family's emotional style for offering a dynamic of informality, frankness, and affectionate solidarity between parents and children, contrasting American individualist ideals that discouraged deep emotional intertwinement. Writer Eva Hoffman, who immigrated from Poland to America after her parents survived the Holocaust in hiding, articulated this cultural difference and its potentially unnerving implications in some very simple and profound terms, remarking on the American context, "Familial bonds seem so dangerously loose here." An undeniably painful dynamic arose within the close-knit Sendak family unit as news of real-life horror stories penetrated their Brooklyn home in the 1940s. Jewish relatives were being deported and murdered overseas. Sadie and Philip continuously received word of Jewish deaths in Europe by way of American agencies and Philip's social club. Sadie would yell and pull at her hair. Philip would collapse and disappear emotionally. They displayed photographs of nieces and nephews sent to concentration camps, including newlyweds and infants. These images were all that Sendak knew of most of his extended family. "It was suffocating, unhappy," the artist would later recall. "Almost like my father was blaming me for being alive. Dead Jews hung all over the place." Sadie and Philip constantly contrasted their youngest son's irreverent energies with those idealized young relatives in Poland whom they mourned. If Sendak complained or misbehaved, Sadie and Philip were quick to call him Wildechaya, or Wild Thing, as multiple sources attest to, shaming him for taking his privileges for granted, privileges denied his cousins overseas, who starved in concentration camps and burned in ovens. Sendak despised these reminders of his own vulnerability as a Jew, even in America. Clearly, the Sendak's proximity to migration and collective trauma colored the tone of their household and separated it from other American homes. But again, Philip and Sadie were not unusual among Yiddish-speaking Jews in their impulse to expose their children to historical horrors, even those as stark as genocide. As Hasia Diner's work reveals, contrary to narratives that assert a universal silence about the events of the Holocaust in the immediate aftermath of World War II, Yiddish schools and periodicals did discuss these events almost immediately, beginning actually with Kristallnacht on November 9th, 1938. Children's journals like the Kinder Zhurnal, in a recurring section titled Neues von der Welt, News from the World, detailed accounts of ghettos, gassing, and other atrocities committed against Jews in Poland. Yiddish writers even made emotional appeals to Jewish children. A 1942 issue, for example, features a front-page story about the hundreds of homeless Jewish refugee children in America rescued from the war by the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee and the United Palestine Appeal. One photograph depicts a group of such children, explaining that they cannot muster a smile because their hearts are weighted with grief. The murder of Jewish relatives in Europe during World War II surely complicated American Jewish parents' expectations of their own children. In the Sendak's Bensonhurst neighborhood, the Orthodox congregation Sons of Israel emphasized the role of the Jewish child for the rebirth and destiny of post-war American Jewry. Their 1947 yearbook celebrated the sight of children as young as 7 or 8 studying Chumash and recalled that cherubim were said to resemble children, symbolizing the role of youth in guarding and transmitting Jewish tradition to future generations. Often, however, post-war American children were also reminders to their parents of those relatives who did not live to know them or who could never be sufficiently replaced. Comparisons and associations made between Jewish children and lost relatives were undeniably burdensome for those children. Some parents paradoxically demanded that their post-war offspring both preserve the family's painful history while also becoming exceptionally successful and carefree to compensate for losses and to spite Hitler. Speaking for himself and his siblings, Sendak would later lament, "We didn't know who we were, and whatever we chose to be was seemingly in opposition to what our parents wanted us to be." Around 1948, Sendak began psychoanalysis with Dr. Bertram Slav, who was gay and Jewish, like Sendak. Sendak might have been attracted to Slav's clinical focus on the emotional plight of gifted youth, whose creative interiority isolated them from the wider society. Slav's publications in adolescent psychiatry would advocate against pathologizing those whose distress reflected merely the suffering of a misunderstood creative personality rather than a character disorder. Slav wrote of the gifted individual, "This person," and I quote him, "is likely not to have developed successfully the kinds of support systems more generally available, such as stable and predictable family and career anchorages. He is likely to be unique and alone, sometimes gloriously so, sometimes devastatingly so." Exploring his own childhood in analysis, Sendak began to notice the behavior of other children, those playing on his parents' block in Brooklyn. He started a sketchbook to record their quirky antics. These children appealed to Sendak's creativity as a socially uninitiated, sensitive human being. These children resided, in some ways like Sendak, before, outside, or somehow even despite dominant social meanings. For Sendak, who claimed to have missed his own adolescence, childhood fantasy play modeled strategic pathways for surviving a life experienced as not fully his own. Children, as he knew, are regularly asked to surrender themselves to powerful others' emotional needs in order to secure the care required for their own survival. They may at times disappear emotionally while remaining present in the performances expected of them. Children at play are experts at emptying their consciousness to become whatever role they enact. They exhibit the powers of comic book heroes who traverse time and space, moving back and forth between fantasy and reality in ways most adults no longer remember how to do. In other words, Sendak found that children had something to teach adults like himself who lived between worlds. Children are designed for literature and primed for navigating jolts and unknowns through play and fantasy. Thus, they led the way for Sendak's artistic project. When Sendak first encountered Ursula Nordstrom, the editor of children's books at Harper, who would later champion his early career, the 22-year-old artist appeared somewhat childlike himself, He was so withdrawn that Nordstrom felt compelled to ask his age. Still, the following day, after studying his sketchbook, she hired him to illustrate Marcel Aimé's The Wonderful Farm in 1951, and his career took off from there. By the following year, Sendak's financial success as a Harper illustrator enabled him to move to Manhattan full-time. Challenging picture book convention, his illustrations for Ruth Krauss's A Hole is to Dig in 1952 featured unruly, ethnically marginal urban kids who defy the normative Anglo ideals of childhood innocence and restraint. Commenting on his drawings of Brooklyn children, Sendak shared, and I quote him, "They're all a kind of caricature of me. They look as if they've been hit on the head, and hit so hard they weren't ever going to grow up anymore. They were old before their time, most of them Jewish, like little greenhorns just off the boat. They had a kind of bowed look, as if the burdens of the world were on their shoulders." Sendak had not meant for the children of these early books to look like nervous, elderly people, as some commentators viewed them. He simply drew kids the way he remembered them from Brooklyn, much unlike the depictions of previously existing picture books featuring children from what he called other neighborhoods and planets. In the artist's collaborations with his brother, Jack, in the mid-1950s, the brothers reflected their family's Yiddish bedtime stories, conveying otherworldly folk traditions and celebrating positions of affective difference and peculiarities of intuition. In an early example, The Happy Rain, 1956, which was written by Jack Sendak and illustrated by the 28-year-old Maurice, children grow up in the fictional village of Troken, in which it is the norm for the skies to pour out rain that drenches their clothes and muddies the streets. When the rain suddenly ceases and the sun comes out to shine, the villagers weep and wail and fear that the world is coming to an end. Attempting to bring back the rain, the villagers follow various misinformed advisors in a series of events that, if you're familiar, is reminiscent of the Yiddish Chelm stories. They proceed to fire cannons into the sky while standing upside down, wearing paper bags over their heads, all to no avail, until Raymond and Yolanda, a young brother and sister pair, save the day by considering the clouds' feelings and sending them a note. Raymond is depicted peering out his window, with Yolanda huddled on the bed by his side. This close sibling pair share not only a bedroom, but also a secret imaginary world, like the Sendaks. The last illustration of Happy Rain depicts the rain-soaked villagers in a joyous hora, holding hands in a circle, their feet kicking in the rhythm of a grapevine. In the center of the circle, Sendak draws Raymond and Yolanda, their eyes closed and heads leaning one against the other. These siblings find solace and comfort in each other amidst a family and a community that feels uneasy about sunny optimism and prefers heavy, emotive rain, a possible stand-in for the tone of Jewish Brooklyn of the 30s or 40s, vis-a-vis the wider culture. The following year, in Circus Girl, which was also written by Jack and illustrated by Maurice, Flora, the protagonist, is a social outsider who ventures away from the circus in which she was born. She tightropes across a suburban neighborhood street to spy on the normative, uncomplicated suburbanites who live there. In one image, the viewer stands outside with Flora, looking through a window into a warm domestic dinner scene in which adults prepare the meal while a seated boy engages with a happy pet. Casting an elongated shadow against the white house, Flora is a balletic loner who stands in contrast to the relaxed child inside. Her feet parted in fourth position with a bow on her waist and a band constricting her head, she is a child poised to work and perform in order to belong. Unlike the children depicted in All of a Kind Family, Flora and other children Sendak visualized in his early work did not seamlessly fit into their surroundings. Instead, they traversed divergent cultural spaces and contemplated questions of authenticity, belonging, and the fluidity of self. In 1962, Sendak illustrated a short story collection by the Yiddish-American writer Isaac Bashevis Singer called Zlata the Goat. Upon the book's publication, the artist cried with his parents as they identified images he had drawn from the photographs of Philip's handsome younger brothers and female relatives with long hair and flowers. Sendak chose to draw murdered relatives from both sides of his family in a realistic style to revive them somewhat for his parents. The careful, intricate cross-hatching of these drawings is lovingly executed. The fine penwork gives a fuzzy softness to light and space, which, lacking harsh contour, hums like a dreamscape that dissolves at its seams. In this project, Sendak's creativity functioned not only as a personal exorcism, but also as a living memorial to loved ones and to their lost worlds. By the last decades of the 20th century, Sendak's work more explicitly confronted the traumas that plagued his family during his adolescence. A strange synergy existed for the artist between his perception of those children whose lives had been forcibly cut short and marginalized and emotionally displaced subjects like himself, who were safe technically and who wished to grow up, but who found it difficult in a society that ignored, misunderstood, or endangered them. In Sendak's designs for the Nutcracker Ballet in the 1980s, he presented Clara as a lonely creative child whose dreams of the future are weighted with references to grim realities. The artist reinterpreted the ballet's original text as a story about the pain of growing up misunderstood. He transformed Clara, who's imagined as about 7 or 8 years old, into an adolescent, into someone of about 11 or 12 years old, years of age, and imagined after the scene in which Clara enacts her defiance and throws a shoe at the Mouse King, Sendak envisioned the fantasy that Clara experiences, in which she becomes an adult and sails across the stage in a ship, with the design that you see on screen here. Among the darker elements that punctuate Clara's fantasies are references to Auschwitz. Lurking above the ship you see, in which a suddenly matured Clara sets sail, boys sit in structures that resemble guard towers and wear shirts striped vertically in white and faded blue, like camp prisoners. Even more explicitly, when planning his illustrations for the picture book Dear Millie in 1988, the artist envisioned a Holocaust story that would explicitly feature Anne Frank, as well as a scene in which children are marched to Auschwitz. He drew these children crossing a shaky bridge with a guard tower looming behind them. The book also depicts Anne Frank together with children of the French town of Izieu, who were murdered under Klaus Barbie at the end of World War II. Together, these children form a choir led by Mozart in heaven. Like French writer and Auschwitz survivor Charlotte Delvau's post-war account of living a double existence, a split self that enables the survivor to ward off traumatic brushes with death, Dear Millie follows a child who hides alone in the forest, followed by a doppelganger, a guardian angel who eventually claims her for heaven. In the original 1984 storyboard, the girl has cropped dark hair, like Anne Frank, but becomes blonde when she dies in the woods upon meeting her ghostly golden-haired double. For the final paintings, however, Sendak would lengthen their hair and keep the protagonist a brunette, preserving her distinctiveness, perhaps, within the implied grip of Aryanization and impending death. The year following the book's publication, a 61-year-old Sendak noted that Anne Frank would have been about the same age at the time, and that she had dreamed of being a writer. He insisted that he achieved his own literary successes in part to share them vicariously with her and with others like her whose lives had been cut short. Sendak also collaborated with Tony Kushner on a staging of Brundibar based on the 1939 opera of the same name by Hans Krasse and performed over 50 times by child prisoners in Theresienstadt. The artist would work with Kushner on a picture book version of the opera as well in 2003. For visual research, Sendak borrowed an original 1943 watercolor of the stage design used in the camp, and I present that courtesy of Justin Cami from his own family archive. Like the original set design, Sendak's crayon and watercolor renditions are rich in reds and yellows and reimagine the opera's landscape with similar textures of brick and rickety wooden planks. Against the visual subtext of poverty, disease, and cruel competition, the children in this rendition transform into grizzly bears to fight off bullies, as well as confer with talking cats and sparrows, growing sideways, so to speak, into the wild animal realm and banding tightly together in order to survive a dangerous social reality. They also represent a variety of physiognomies, and some of them are branded with yellow stars. Reflecting the historical fact that most of the Theresienstadt child performers of Brundibar were deported to their deaths, Sendak ends this book with a warning about the perennial nature of hatred. Even seemingly defeated villains tend to return in one way or another, the book's ending asserts. In one of the final images, weeping mothers appear beneath giant blackbirds who carry their children away into the night sky. While working on this project, Sendak joined Glenn Dixon's Shirim Klezmer Orchestra to participate in a project called Pinkas and the Pig, a klezmer version of Sergei Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf. While writing the script, Sendak made Peter into Pinkas, after his father Philip's Yiddish name, Pinchas. Chazer was the new name for the wolf. Chazer was an epithet that Sendak's aunt used in reference to anti-Semites in Poland. The artist even offered his own voice for the recorded narration, infusing the language and tone with embodied cadences of his late relatives and thus bringing them back to life. And I'll play just a short clip of that narration. We'll see if that works on your end.
On the branch of a big old tree, a little birdie sat kvetching away. Oi, vey, oi, Gott in Himmel, the gate is open. Is Pinkas looking to get killed again? Surely Chazer, a devil pig, and his gang of schmutzige, vile Schwein will patch poor Pinkas into chopped liver.
So hopefully you could hear that, and if not, it is, I think, available in full on YouTube if you search Pinkas and the Pig. But you can really hear how Sendak delights in bringing back to life some of the cadences and inflections and terminology that his family might have used. The script specifically features a duck and a bird who banter with each other, and he draws them on the cover art as you see on screen. The duck wearing a black hat and sidelocks, and the bird wearing a yarmulke. The script for Pinkas ends with a glossary of over 12 Yiddish terms, their definitions humorously composed. So emotionally drained by Brundibar around the same time, the artist appreciated this opportunity to work on a more playful project about his roots that also ended in a child's tangible triumph. Chazer, the evil predator, is caught by the end and sent to the unkosher butcher. So at this point, I want to switch gears before I move into my conclusion and just bring our attention to the fact that this Friday, May 8th, will mark 8 years since the passing of Maurice Sendak. And of course, you don't need me to tell you that his cultural power has really outlasted his lifetime. Just as one interesting example, a few months ago, the New York Public Library shared that Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are is the 4th most checked out book in the entire history of the New York Public Library system. Sendak's particular sensibilities and creative vision continue to hold resonance, and perhaps never more than at this present moment, in which a public health crisis keeps us separated, if we're lucky enough to stay home, but also heightens our awareness of the bonds that matter to us and our own capacities in the face of danger. I recently had the opportunity to converse with a close relation of Sendak's late partner who knew the artist well during his lifetime, and he had some thoughts and insights about how Sendak might have thought about or approached the current moment of coronavirus and social distancing, and how that might have impacted his work potentially if he were still alive. And I want to share just one quote from our phone conversation a couple of weeks ago. I'll just read it out for you. This is exactly the kind of world that Maurice was talking about his whole life. We're all reduced to being the child in any of his books, where we're looking at a force that's radically changing our world that we cannot control and we cannot do anything about other than through our own actions. And that's kind of what every story that he told is about. We all are on our own. So you can only imagine the richness of the story that he might have put together about Trump and COVID-19, with all the elderly dying at a rate far higher and the oppressed This is a weird reflection of 1933 to 45 in a kind of natural world. And that's sort of what I think a lot of his stories were. It's kind of like these unseen forces that come and wreck our lives, and we can't do anything about it except kind of invent a story and move on. You really have to look at the dark forces in the world to understand where he got motivations and stories from, and he would turn them into the beautiful pictures and the beautiful stories, born of a really dark outlook and set of events that underlie everything. I don't think you can divorce the Jewish perspective from any of that. So to conclude, in this talk, to reiterate, I've argued that Sendak's work has transformed and universalized an embodied experience balanced between marginalized elements of Jewish culture and memory that he internalized and broader expectations of generic acculturation that targeted the symbolic space of childhood, sensitive to outer threats from infancy and emotionally displaced in his own adolescence by the despair of wartime losses during an era of widespread acculturation. Sendak found himself identifying with young children and their capacity for tightroping across disparate worlds as socially uninitiated, creative sufferers. As he struggled to actualize his life and career as an adult in the 1940s and 50s, the marginal space of children's literature appealed to him as a place to express his creativity in hiding, so to speak. He sought to resolve his own internal conflicts by exploring how children manage to comprehend and survive exclusion and danger. In his work, peculiar and sensitive children balance across limbo realms, situated between ethnically othered family members, inaccessible yet inescapable forms of memory, and a society that seeks to impose demands of assimilation upon minority subjects without always meeting them where they are. Sendak found his artistic voice in the service of expanding the culture's conception of childhood, building creatively on existing critiques of mid-century America's socially conformist and exclusionary culture, and thereby contributing a dignified mirror to those people especially marginalized by that culture and its values. The current project thus furthers understanding of how social categories such as childhood may operate as cultural sites through which broad historical and political realities are negotiated, including questions of national identity. Inspired by psychological exploration of his own emotional world as a young person, Sendak challenged the notion that children comprise a singular generic category of raw matter for adult shaping, a notion fueled by exclusionary cultural incentives. His work insisted that, regardless of their age, children are in fact diverse human agents who embody transnational histories and complex orientations, and that comprise the seeds of a vibrant, evolving future beyond the limits of established conventions. Through depictions of wild, irreverent, flamboyant, or culturally unusual children, Sendak pointed to counterintuitive social virtues that may accompany seemingly negative or strange bodies and affects, suggesting that the social other might make for an ideal teacher on matters of resilience, survival strategies, and the importance of metaphor and fantasy for the preservation of sensitive internal meanings. So that's where I'd like to stop. And I want to first just thank you for your generous attention.